listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
We're continuing the history of the battle for the Augsburg Confession in 19th century America. We're almost to the 19th century.
We're getting there.
Pretty close.
It's so interesting.
Today's episode of The Coffee Hour is underwritten in part by Concordia University Irvine. You can learn more about Concordia University Irvine by visiting cui.edu. Joining us today, the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie. He's the Forrest E. and Francis H. Ellis Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, helping us take a look at the history of the battle for the Augsburg Confession in 19th century America. Dr. MacKenzie, welcome back.
Well, thank you, Andy and Sarah. I'm glad to be back.
So last time we left off around the Revolution, and that means that there wouldn't have been, there was kind of a tapering off of immigrants coming from parts of Europe after the Revolution. So where does this leave us now in terms of Lutherans in North America?
Yeah. When we get to, let's just call it the period of the new American nation, we have a couple of things going on here. We do end up with a revolution in France that spreads all over Europe, leads to the Napoleonic Wars. And that is a big factor, too, in why we don't get lots of people coming to America. And then there is the other side of things that who would want to go to America anyway? They're kind of a rebellious people. And so why would somebody want to go here? So it's going to take a while for the migration to pick up, especially from German lands. We got to wait till really kind of the 1830s and we start getting a lot more Germans coming. Now, it's largely true in the history of the United States that immigrants don't assimilate rapidly while large numbers of immigrants continue to come, and because the new immigrants always are reinforcing the old world values. But if they're not coming, then the immigrants over the generations more easily assimilate. And so that's one of the things that's happening to the German population of places like Pennsylvania, especially, but New York and elsewhere. They're starting to assimilate. And that means second and third generations are no longer really enthusiastic about maintaining the German language, German culture, etc. They want to go English. But as we saw with the Swedes at the end of our conversation last time, going English could mean giving up your Lutheranism as well. And so this becomes a battle in places like Philadelphia as to whether the Lutherans should embrace the English language, and there's resistance to it. The thought that is if you give up German, you're going to give up your Lutheranism. So this becomes an issue. And it is true that lots of people, when they make the move into the English-speaking world, also will make the move into English-speaking religion. Another problem that arises for maintaining any sort of Lutheran ethos or Lutheran identity has to do with the expansion of the population from the east to the other side of the Appalachians. The Northwest Territory is being opened up for settlement and expansion. People are going to move west, not to establish churches, but to get some cheap farmland and try to better themselves and their families economically. So if there was a lack of preachers before the American Revolution, it's become an even greater problem when we have the scattering of the population through the new Western territories, the Midwest territories as well. And so that's another issue that's going to make it hard for Lutheranism to survive. The German language culture is being given up. People are moving to territories where there aren't any preachers. And if there are preachers, they're probably not going to be Lutheran preachers. So you're going to lose lots of folks in this period to Lutheranism. Furthermore, complicating the story is the fact that those who actually do preach the gospel in these new frontier territories will not have really any kind of real contact with the sort of theological education that the Muhlenberg generation had. Those folks at all had kind of theological training, seminary training, university training from the old world. Nobody is going to have that in the second and third generations, with the exception of a few who get sent back to Europe for that kind of education. Muhlenberg did that with his sons, but they are really quite unusual. Most training is going to be on-the-job training here in America. And what happens during this period, not only to the Lutherans, but to other denominations as well, that the demand for preachers is such that preachers are accepted on the frontier with very little kind of formal education, with lots of enthusiasm for ministry, but not a whole lot of education for what goes into being what we would think of as an educated pastor who actually knows his Bible, knows his doctrine, can instruct people in the content of the faith. And that's going to mean also no instruction in the Book of Concord, no instruction in the Augsburg Confession. Very little sense that what was essential to Lutheranism in its founding ought still to be essential to Lutheranism now in the new American nation. And I'm going to add one more point, and that is there's something in the American ethos which said, we don't want that corrupt stuff from the old world. We have a new way of doing things. We're Americans. We have representative government. We don't need the old corrupt institutions from Europe. So there would not be a whole lot of even interest in saying, oh, yeah, we ought to go back to Germany and we ought to find out what the German Lutherans are doing. No, that's old world corruption. We don't want that. We're Americans. It's new. We're going to do it better. So in this period, we have pastors rising from the ranks, working hard to establish churches and congregations, and yet with no formal training at all. I'm going to give you one example. This is a man who helped to form the Ohio Synod. His name was Stauch, John Stauch, born in York, Pennsylvania. He came from a poor background, but he wanted to be a preacher. His pastor advised him to wait a little bit to see if they really have this desire. He had it. He moved west. People knew he wanted to be a preacher. They didn't have a preacher, so they asked him to preach. And so he began to do that. He went to one of the early church bodies and got kind of licensed as a lay preacher. Then later on, after a successful ministry, he's finally ordained. He helped to form the Ohio Synod, eager to do all of these things, famous for how many churches he helped to found and so forth. And yet he had no seminary training at all, had no sense of what the Book of Concord was, but he was a great frontier preacher. He's kind of exceptional in that he became famous and was so successful, but he's not exceptional in terms of the lack of training and the lack of kind of theological depth and understanding that many of these men had. So the question was, well, will Lutheranism survive in this kind of situation? Or maybe everybody will just become a Methodist because this was more like the Methodist method than it was the traditional Lutheran method. Well, Lutheranism did survive, but just barely. Mentioned to you that the Muhlenberg established the first Lutheran church body. It was called the Pennsylvania Ministerium. About a generation later, they established another one in New York. There was also a similar kind of institution established in Virginia, and then even down in Georgia. Because of the influence of revolutionary thinking, or what should we say, democratic Republican type government, the new organizations and the old ones now become synods rather than just ministeria. In other words, groups not just of pastors, but of groups of pastors and congregations. So the Pennsylvania Ministerium got a new constitution in 1792 that permitted congregations to send representatives as well as their pastors. But that new constitution did not even mention the Augsburg Confession, did not mention the Lutheran confessions. And that became characteristic of these little groups that pop up as new Lutheran church bodies. Well, they're Lutheran because the people say that they're Lutheran, but in their constitutions, they have zero mention of the Lutheran confessions. None. What makes them Lutheran is maybe the name. The one in Georgia was kind of interesting because one of the leaders in the establishment of the, the North Carolina, it was wrong, not Georgia, North Carolina Synod, was a fellow by the name of Gottlieb Schober. And he's the first president, and he's not even a Lutheran. He's a Moravian. And one of their first missionaries was an Anglican, not a Lutheran. So we're really running the risk of losing the entire Lutheran identity during this period, the first couple of decades of the 19th century. However, another figure enters the scene. After Muhlenberg, he's probably the most important of the Lutheran leaders here in North America in this early period, and that is Samuel Simon Schmucker. Samuel Simon Schmucker. He was born in America. His father had been a Lutheran pastor, and the father wanted to make sure that his son got some kind of formal education, so actually sent him to an American university, and that was Princeton. Now, Princeton was not Lutheran. Today, I don't think people think much that has a denominational orientation at all, but it was Presbyterian when it was founded. And so Schmucker ended up going to a Presbyterian school and learned his theology under Presbyterians. And although he remained a Lutheran, as we'll see, he didn't remain a very good Lutheran. But nonetheless, he was more Lutheran than people like John Stauch. So why don't we take our break, Andy, and we'll come back and we'll finish up with Schmucker.
Yeah, we'll share more of his story after the break. You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
At Concordia University Irvine, you have the freedom to explore your future and your faith. Across over 60 on-campus and online programs, you'll experience Christian education that's uniquely designed to develop the whole person, to prepare you not just for your career, but for all of your callings in life. Here you'll explore life's toughest questions, gain lifelong skills, and make relationships that last a lifetime. Concordia University Irvine. Learn more at cui.edu.
You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
We're talking with Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, professor of historical theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, and we are telling the story of Samuel Schmucker. So what happens with Samuel Schmucker?
Well, what happens with Samuel Schmucker is that he recognizes that Lutheranism has a distinctive role to play in church history as being the first of the Protestant denominations. So even though here in America, the large Protestant denominations were the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, and now the Methodists. Methodists were new in the 18th century, but were thriving here in the new American nation, as well as the Baptists too, were another prominent denomination. But among them were the Lutherans, and Schmucker realized that, historically speaking, the Lutherans were the first of the great Protestant denominations. And he, raised as a Lutheran, was proud of kind of the Lutheran version of Protestantism. And so he thought that it was worthwhile maintaining Lutheranism, but now defining it more precisely than it had been, or than it was in his own time and territory. And that what was needed were Lutheran institutions that could keep the Lutheran identity even while Lutherans became more American and English, using English language and so forth. He and a handful of others, concerned about losing the Lutheran identity, came up with a twofold solution. One was the establishment of a national Lutheran church body to which these geographically based synods could belong, so that the New York Ministerium and the Pennsylvania Ministerium and the North Carolina Synod and the Ohio Synod could all belong to a synodical conference, or what they called the General Evangelical Lutheran Synod. So the synods would belong to this big national church body, and that would then enable the Lutherans then to maintain kind of a national identity, to preserve the institutions that they were developing, to kind of help one another in doing big projects. And among the big projects that Schmucker thought would be really helpful for maintaining and establishing an American Lutheran identity was the establishment of a seminary. So in the early 1820s, this young pastor, Schmucker, but an educated man, along with like his father and a handful of others, worked to do both things, establish a national Lutheran church body, and then also to establish a seminary. Now, the National Lutheran Church Body was the General Synod, and I said, as I said, to it belonged geographic synods. There weren't all that many, and they weren't all that excited about a National Lutheran Church Body. But Schmucker and others made this commitment, and so they got going in 1820, but it almost fell apart. And one of the reasons that it almost fell apart was because this is the era where America is experiencing what we call sectionalism, the South, the North, the West, and a lot of states' rights, and they're not in favor of big institution. And it's the era of Andy Jackson is going to come along and say we shouldn't have a national bank, etc. So not everybody was excited about having some sort of national church body which might infringe upon local rights and privileges. But Schmucker worked hard. At one point, they even had to create a new synod in order to get enough synodical votes to maintain and establish the general. But they did. So we get a national church body which has Lutheran as a part of its name. It still doesn't have the Lutheran confessions, but it does have Lutheran as a part of its name. And those same folks, under Schmucker's prodding, establish a seminary. And this seminary is located in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and it is the seminary which is at the heart of the Battle of Gettysburg during the Civil War. So if you go and visit the Gettysburg battlefield, part of what you can see is Gettysburg Seminary. It's a Lutheran seminary, and they still have buildings where they have cannonballs stuck in the walls, or at least the marks of the cannonballs from the Civil War. Anyway, Schmucker is chosen as his first professor, and he becomes then a professor of theology at Gettysburg Seminary. And he knows that the Augsburg Confession historically was the foundation for the Lutheran Church. And so he wants to preserve Lutheranism and do it by maintaining this connection with the Augsburg Confession. And so the new seminary is attached to the Augsburg Confession. Now, it's not the way we do confessionalism. We pledge ourselves to the Augsburg Confession and the other Lutheran confessions because they teach the doctrines that are taught in the Bible. Schmucker articulated his connection by using the term fundamental. And what he said was the school was committed to the fundamental articles of the Christian religion as taught in the Augsburg Confession. So it's not a commitment to the Augsburg Confession so much as it is to the fundamental articles. And this became, as we'll see really in the next episode, but it becomes a very important marker of Schmucker's confessionalism that will differentiate it from Old World European or New World confessional Lutheranism, because it's restricted to the fundamental articles. Now, what did he mean by the fundamental articles? We'll go back to what I said about his commitment to Lutheranism as the first of the great Protestant denominations. It was the Protestant character of the Augsburg Confession that Schmucker found so attractive. Perhaps you remember that at the time of the American Revolution, American elites were enlightened Christians. They were rationalist Christians. They were deist Christians. Well, there's a reaction against that in the 1800s. America experiences a second Great Awakening in which the religious leaders, people like Beecher and Finney and others, are all kind of Bible-thumping Protestants, believing in the Trinity, believing in the vicarious atonement, believing in the supernatural character of the Christian religion, repudiating deism and rationalism. And that's true of Schmucker too. So for Schmucker, the important things in religion and Protestantism are the Bible, Bible authority, the person of Jesus Christ, the death of Jesus Christ to save people from sins, the doctrine of the Trinity, all of the things that the American evangelical Protestants were preaching and teaching as a part of the Second Great Awakening. So Schmucker, theologically, is arguing for a Lutheranism that is Protestant And because we're in America and we reject old world Christianity, it's American Lutheranism. And that means the fundamental articles. It does not mean the stuff that distinguished Lutherans from other Protestants, in particular the doctrine of the sacraments. So Schmucker's confessionalism, Schmucker's Lutheranism, is a Lutheranism shorn of the Lutheran distinctives. So Schmucker wants to be confessional, but he doesn't really want to be theologically Lutheran. He wants to be American evangelical Protestant. So that's the kind of Lutheranism that, and he's really, in a certain way, he's rescued Lutheranism, but he hasn't rescued it as pure Lutheranism. He's rescued the name. He's attached it to a part of the Lutheran theological heritage, but we're not really back to the Augsburg Confession as the 16th century reformers thought about it and expressed it and pledged themselves to it. Now, there's another aspect of this that I'll mention here kind of quickly, and that is, how do you do Christianity? Well, the way you do Christianity in 19th century early America is you do it as a frontier revivalist evangelical preacher. And there is a lot of concern about what's called the new measures. The great name among the evangelical Protestants is one I suggested a few minutes ago, and that was Finney. Finney, the evangelical preacher, had developed a way to revive Christianity through revival preaching and methods. These are called the new measures. And they involve things like going to a town, having all the pastors join together, have long extended meetings, lots of emotionally charged preaching and teaching, putting people who want to be converted into a special place where they can be especially addressed and prayed for. It's called the anxious bench, and moving people to have this kind of emotional appropriation of the Christian religion in this basic Protestant form that we're talking about. And Schmucker and others embrace that. And so you have a limited kind of confessionalism connected with a kind of Methodistic, revivalistic kind of church service revival that put it into a package, and you've got American Lutheranism, and that's the kind of Lutheranism that's taking shape under the leadership of Samuel Simon Schmucker.
Where will we go in our next episode?
Well, Schmucker gets the first word on how to understand the Augsburg Confession, but not the last word. And we will see that there is a reaction against Schmuckerism. Just as Schmucker and his company were a reaction against the deists, we're going to get a reaction against Schmucker and his American Lutheranism.
Schmuckerism. That's a new one for me. I'm going to write that down. Our guest today, the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, the Forrest E. and Francis H. Ellis Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne. Dr. MacKenzie, thanks for this great history.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it.
Looking forward to next time.
Yeah,
I am listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support The Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@kfuo.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.